Welcome, everyone. My name is Martin Rasser. I'm a senior fellow here in the Technology National Security Program at the Center for Numerical Security. And welcome to this event on biotechnology and American competitiveness. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our amazing panel today. We have a tremendous group of speakers joining us. We have Dr. Diane DiEuliis, Senior Research Fellow at the National Defense University, Dr. Jason Kelly, co-founder and CEO of Ginkgo Bioworks, Dr. Tara O'Toole, Executive Vice President and Senior Fellow at In-Q-Tel, and Dr. Megan Palmer, Executive Director for Biopolicy and Leadership Initiatives at Stanford University. So I asked each of our speakers to provide some opening remarks just to set the scene, particularly focusing their expertise and viewpoints on the general theme for today's discussion. But we also want to get you involved with the discussion. You'll see at the bottom of your screen, you have a raise hand feature if you'd like to pose your question in person, or you can use the Q&A feature where you can type out your question and then I will pose your question to our guests. We're going to start in alphabetical order. So we'll start with Diane and then go to Jason, Tara, and Megan. Look forward to a great discussion. Thank you all for being here. Diane, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Martin, thank you so much for that kind introduction and for inviting me to speak. I'm so excited to be on this panel with some of my great colleagues here that I've interacted with many times before on this topic. So I'm going to start my comments just by sort of broadly introducing this idea of a bioeconomy, how we think about the bioeconomy, and sort of how we can go about protecting and promoting the US bioeconomy. So around the world, people use the term bioeconomy in different ways. And I was involved with a study last year that was sponsored by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence at the National Academies, called Safeguarding the Bioeconomy. And that study, people have heard me talk about it before, but the study was important because it had sort of two big parts to it. One is, how do we measure the US bioeconomy and the contributions to the United States of all this new and emerging technology, both financially and to national security? And then how do we promote it and protect it? And so that first half is so important because you can't really measure something until you've defined what it is. So the study did a good job of thinking through that and defining the US bioeconomy as economic activity that's driven by research and innovation in the life sciences and biotechnology that's enabled by advances in engineering and computing and information sciences, right? So that sounds pretty broad, and the bioeconomy is really broad. So where we may have traditionally thought about it in the space of biomedicine, in the space of agriculture, we're now looking at biotechnology as part of commodities, of specialty materials, of biofuels, right? So using biotechnology to make things that we may not have traditionally made that way, or things that we may have made through petroleum or chemical processes. So very exciting. And so with that broad definition, the committee kind of determined that the US bioeconomy is probably worth more than 1 trillion, and that might be a conservative estimate moving forward. And I'm sure some of the other speakers will talk about that. Okay, so how do we go about promoting the US bioeconomy, ensuring that it's competitive and protecting it in that competitive stance? Well, the first and foremost, we talked about the support of the R&D infrastructure, right? So biotechnology has thrived and advanced for decades because we have a very robust R&D infrastructure here in the US, and we invest in that. But moreover, one of the things that has come up over and over again as we talk about the bioeconomy is we need a workforce to people the bioeconomy. And I'm starting to talk about that more. I'll be interested in what the other speakers have to say about that, because it's not just, STEM education, right? It's not just cranking out people with PhDs that go into R&D, but it's about actually the people who are going to work in the bioeconomy of the future, the people who are going to work at, manage these biomanufacturing platforms of the future. So those are some of the things that we talked about as promoting or driving the bioeconomy. But the bioeconomy has some vulnerabilities, and some of these were really brought to the fore during COVID-19, which I'll say more about in a minute. But first and foremost, one of the things we talked about in the NAS report was bioeconomic value chains, right? So how does the supply chain work in the United States? And we've been observing, long before COVID-19, we've been observing this sort of erosion of US supply chains, where we're relying on single source and foreign components to bring important things into the United States, or raw materials for things that we need for manufacturing here in the United States. And again, so COVID brought a lot of this to the fore, but we'd already been having some of these problems to begin with. So how do we find new and creative ways of building maybe active pharmaceutical compounds through the bioeconomy, or other kinds of raw materials that we need, not just for COVID, but for lots of other things moving forward. So when I mentioned that definition, I talked about emerging biotech and advances in engineering and computing and information sciences. So essentially, we're looking at all of the data and the information science that comes together with biotechnology. And every place where these two fields come together could be a point of cybersecurity vulnerability, right? So everywhere from gathering data, banking data, ensuring the integrity and curation of data, all the way up through and including the automation of biological platforms and manufacturing, for example. So there's a big swath there of intersection of biotechnology and information technology. And so we made at least 3 recommendations in that report of things that the US could do to shore up our digital biosecurity and protect our bioeconomy on the cyber side of things. And so the last thing I want to mention is, we talk about the bioeconomy in terms of competition, and we are in competition with, peer competitors like China, for example, Russia, others. Many countries have stated, this is our plan, this is our strategy. China would like to be the global supplier of all things bioeconomy by 2025, for example. So what's our strategy going to be? What's the US strategy for pushing innovation and research in the bioeconomy? So again, these are just some of the things to think about in conjunction with the bioeconomy. How do we build a strategy? How do we build firmer security around some of our bioeconomy? How do we promote it through our existing infrastructure and get more people involved? And so those are just kind of the high points. The last thing I will say is that I mentioned that a lot of vulnerabilities associated with the bioeconomy were brought to the fore during COVID. And I know there are others on this panel who can say a lot more about that. I want to just say one thing in closing my remarks out, is that I think we're at a very unique point in time where we've just been through this devastating pandemic that shut down our economy, and we're just starting to open things back up again and re-energize our economy again. This could be the perfect opportunity, the perfect time to say, let's not just build the old stuff back again. Maybe let's look at how do we build some of these new things, new ways of doing things, new ways of building our stockpile, for example, for pandemics, using biotechnology in very innovative ways. So, hopefully that's ending on a positive note. And Martin, I will turn it back to you.
Great, thank you so much, Diane. Jason, let's go to you.
Sure, thanks, Martin. Yeah, so what I'll do is I'll try to give just a bit of an introduction, an inch on the technology, so people can understand really what we think of as synthetic biology as sort of this enabling technology that is kind of getting biotech on people's minds right now. So the core idea behind synthetic biology is that you can program a cell like you program a computer, because fundamentally it runs on digital code in the form of DNA. right? So it's A, T, C's, and G's, not zeros and ones, but you can read that code with DNA sequencing, one of the technologies I'll talk about, and you can write that code with DNA synthesis or DNA printing. And DNA printing literally means you go on a computer, type ATC, GGGG, you hit print, and out of machines in the lab behind me or at big providers like, say, Twist Biosciences out in California, which is the largest DNA printing company in the world, that DNA gets made. And Ginkgo uses a lot of both of these technologies. We're Twist's biggest customer for DNA writing, as an example. And so that ability to read and write code and have a machine to execute it, which is sort of how we think of a cell, that's really programming as we think of it. And so one of the things to keep in the back of your head as you hear about this technology is because that underlying code is common across all life, then you could imagine, just like we had in tech and computers, big horizontal platform companies that are essentially enabling the programming of that code. So think Microsoft with Windows, or Amazon Web Services, or the Intels of the world with common processors. Like, common code leads to common platforms. And that's kind of the moment we're going through right now on the technology side. And I'll give you in a minute a little bit of detail on sort of the scale effects of those technologies. But first, like, where might you come across this in your daily life in terms of cell programming? Like, what are the end products consumers are going to see? So to give you an example, you might be familiar with like the Impossible Burger. So like, this is a veggie burger. You bite into it and it bleeds. Interesting, right? There's a lot of blood in plants. So where's the blood coming from? Well, what Impossible has done is they found the gene for hemoglobin, which is what makes blood red. They take brewer's yeast, like you would use to make beer, and they program it. They add that gene into the genome of the yeast. And then when you brew it up, instead of beer coming out, heme comes out. And you add that back to a burger, and suddenly it smells right, tastes right, cooks right. It's the Impossible Whopper at Burger King, right? And so that is a end product enabled by cell programming on the back end. Okay. The other very widely known product of cell programming on people's minds now is mRNA vaccines, right? That is a piece of mRNA code that is going into your arm, and it's hitting the cells in your body that are turning on and expressing a protein, in this case, spike protein from COVID-19, and turning on your immune system and getting us out of this mess. All right. So those are two very distinct applications of cell programming, very different markets. The underlying technologies that you would work on, that you would use to work on those two applications, are actually common. And Ginkgo's whole business, we're about a $15 billion market cap company based in Boston. Our core technology is essentially being a horizontal platform to do that programming for other companies. And so we've worked with, folks in the animal-free meat space. We work with Bayer in agriculture. We did a project with Moderna last March. All of this infrastructure is used to program cells independent of market. That's the theory of Ginkgo. And so this topic is about competitiveness, the panel today. From a competitiveness standpoint for the US, I think the key thing to keep in mind is these technologies improve with scale. So to take DNA reading, for example, first human genome, $100 million to sequence that back in 2000. Today, from companies like Illumina here in the US or Beijing Genomics, BGI in China, you can get human genome machines that will sequence a human genome for about $100. So 1 million-fold cost reduction over the last 20 years. That's substantially faster than Moore's Law, the rate that computer chips have been improving in that period of time. And you'll note that there's really only those two companies that can do that, because they have achieved a certain scale in their technology to drive those costs that low. This is a lesson from computers. It's a lesson we've seen in tech over and over again. There's a winner-take-all effect in industries that have exponentially improving scale economics. And we are seeing that in DNA reading. We are seeing that in DNA writing. We're seeing it for the technologies Ginkgo develops, which is automation of laboratory work to sort of debug these cells and put the DNA into the cells and test them. And so I think there's a moment right now over the next 5 to 10 years where the Windows is going to get built, the Amazon Web Services, the Intel, Cisco, and the US, when it came to the internet, we sort of got all that stuff without a lot of competition, to be honest, just given like the natural kind of the state of the globe at the time when that technology got built. I think it's not going to be the case this time. I think you're going to see, and you do see, major investments in other countries in this technology. It is not lost on people that it's going to be important from an economic standpoint. And then I won't spend a ton of time on this. Folks on the panel will be better than me. But COVID-19 highlights the strategic relevance of biology in our world. I think if you had asked people a year ago or I guess 2 years ago now, if the US anyway was susceptible to infectious disease at this scale, Tara would have told you yes, but everybody else would have been like, nah, it's been 100 years since the last pandemic. We have much better medicine, like this ain't 1918 anymore. And the reality is, our biosecurity technologies in the US today were not all that different than they were in 1918, right? And we built some new technologies in the form of mRNA vaccines during this pandemic, but it's not over yet worldwide. And we should continue to invest in essentially global biosecurity infrastructure, and the US should lead it. And I think we have a unique window to do that in the next couple of years. And it would be essential, both as a driver of demand to win that economic base here in the US of synthetic biology, but also important from a standpoint of building out this technology responsibly in the future. So that's it for me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jason. And I think it might be a national security think tank first to have somebody bring up the impossible whopper, which I love. So thank you. Tara, let's turn to you, please.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you for the opportunity to be here with your distinguished guests. I'm going to reiterate Diane and Jason's comments that we are in a moment here, that we're at an inflection point with respect to biotechnology and geopolitical competition. Geopolitical competition with China is largely why we're all talking about technology innovation these days. And that's a very important reason. But there's another reason that I think gets left out of the conversation that's very critical, particularly with respect to biotech. And that is that we have a lot of huge problems coming at us that we need to solve. And it's everything from food security to adequate supplies of water to climate change and all that it portends, to disease control, including pandemics, to being able to manufacture what the global population needs without polluting the earth and making climate change worse. I also think those are the reasons why we are likely to recruit more young people into science and into biotech, because I think biotech is going to be the critical technology and addressing, or at least helping to address, all of these looming, really existential problems. People think of biotech in terms of biomed, particularly after the mRNA vaccines helping to pull us out of the pandemic. And that's appropriate. Biomed is the area of biotech that is getting the most investments, particularly venture capital investments by far. But there's two other very broad applications of biotech that we need to keep in mind. One is production. I think biotechnology in the form that Jason just described it is going to become the major manufacturing platform of the 21st century. How fast that happens depends largely on what governments do. The third area that we have to keep in mind is planetary health, environmental restorations. Biotech is not only going to allow us to make chemicals and feedstocks that now come out of petroleum products more in greener ways. It's also going to be key to restoring the ecosystems that we have damaged or messed up. And those three general areas are at different levels of maturation right now. I think it's fair to say that the United States has been the innovation engine of biotechnology, largely as a consequence of our $1 trillion investment in NIH since World War II, as well as our investment in the National Science Foundation and education and basic research generally. But China is aggressively pursuing biotech. It knows it needs it, first of all, to solve its own urgent domestic problems. It is a huge disease burden, very inadequate disease infrastructure. And it is going to use biotech and particularly preventive medicine, precision medicine to try and get ahead of that. It also has a big food insecurity problem, which it's going to try and solve, not just with Impossible Burgers, but by genetically manipulating plants. And it too wants to be the source of everybody's supply chain. What China is doing is not basic science. Their forte is taking other people's scientific discoveries and then moving them into applications into technology. And they are building synthetic biology technology at scale in a way we are not. So what I would recommend for the United States to maintain its capacity in biotech is, first of all, we should be building vital bio infrastructure, as we did with the physical sciences since World War II, but have actually not done in biology. And by that, I mean, we should be building things that buy down risks for everybody who wants to be an entrepreneur or a technologist in this area. So for example, I would build several biofoundries like that which Ginkgo has built across the country to allow entrepreneurs and students, graduate students in universities to learn more and more about synthetic biology. DoD is sponsoring one in conjunction with the University of Minnesota and many companies called BioMade. We ought to do more of that. We ought to upgrade GenBank, make it a lot easier to use and link it to biobanks. For that, we could get specimens from the plethora of natural history museums around the country if we used information technology to link them. And finally, I would engage in some big mission-driven projects that could bring the private sector, the public sector, and universities together, like the Human Genome Project, maybe a little different than the Human Genome Project, but big, ambitious, gnarly problems to solve that would catch the imagination, particularly of the younger generation. And that brings me to my last point. I think that the strategy for tech innovation that CNAS recently put out is brilliant. I think it's terrific. But as the report recognizes, one of the big gaps in realizing that strategy is getting the technical talent into government and into the country in general that we're going to need to actually carry it out. And I don't think we're going to get that technical talent unless we excite young people, not just with geopolitical competition with China, but with the need to solve big problems for their generations and the generations to come. And again, I think biotechnology offers the most promise for moving forward on those problems.
Tara, thank you so much. That was a tremendous overview. Megan, let's turn to you, and then we'll dive deeper into some of these issues during the discussion.
Great. Thanks, Martin, for the invitation to join today. And it's great to be with some old colleagues and friends talking about these issues. So I'm a bioengineer by training, but I've spent the last decade really focused on policy and governance issues that are coupled to advances in biotechnology. And in brief, like other panelists here, I think we're in a moment. I think the stakes are high and the time is really short to be making the types of strategic decisions we need to build a biotechnology future that actually supports rather than undermines both values and our security. And I was reminded in preparing today, at the onset of the pandemic, Jason and I were actually both in the Senate testifying on the topic of US biotechnology leadership. And it's clear that this topic has only grown in importance as we've seen biotechnology tools alongside other innovations critical in countering biological threats. And but many of my main points remain the same. And so I wanted to revisit some of them here today. So moments like this, as Tara was highlighting, I think it's useful to really zoom out and ask, what is the biotechnology future we desire? What do we want to be building? It's a future where we get to develop the foundational science and technology of the living world. It's important to remember when we're talking about all of these other technologies that biology is a technology that has a big lead time on innovation before humans were around, and we still have a lot to learn from. And so we need to be working with a diversity of different innovators all around the world that are developing products with biotechnology around this vast array of applications, that in feeding and fueling and healing in ways that can be intrinsically safer and more sustainable, and then advance these topics, again, as Tara highlighted, not just of national security, but natural security and how we think about interacting with the living world and our environment. It's also important to remember that we're made of biology, and so we need citizens that can participate in and benefit from and are empowered to make wise choices about technologies that ultimately will be interacting with their bodies and their data and their shared environments. And that's a really difficult challenge. And it's also a future where we're dealing with emerging infectious disease all the time, and so we need to be working on strategies where we can, as Andy Weber would put it, render biological threats obsolete in ways by preventing them, rapidly detecting, deterring, and diffusing them. We also need to, again, zoom out and ask, how are we vulnerable, and what are the futures that we need to avoid? And these occur across many technology areas. We've spoken about avoiding a future where we're relying on fragile supply chains. I agree with others here that the biomanufacturing opportunity and challenge is really vast. We need to talk about, as we have in other areas, making sure that these biotechnologies, as they're brought up in different places in the world and also in the US, are not used to suppress freedoms. We need to avoid a future also where we're closing down this rich global science and technology innovation ecosystem that we're all benefiting from, right? That foundational science needs to really be global. And we need to avoid a future where we're getting reckless development of biotechnology that causes new threats. And I honestly think it can't be overstated that we need to avoid a future where misinterpretation of our activities by other nations causes the reconsideration of biotechnology's use as a weapon, right? That is all of this promise built on a foundation of security where we need to preserve that norm and reinforce it continually over time. So what do we need? Many of these strategies have already been mentioned. I think we need at least three things. We need tools and infrastructure, right? We need to be the best, as Jason said, in measuring and making with biology. There's a function of scale here. So we need the infrastructure that can connect many different types of partners across academia and industry and government, connecting them to that key information and materials for innovation. Tara mentioned GenBank and others. That's going to be just absolutely critical. We see those same dynamics across AI and other areas where we rely on sort of shared data resources. We need strategy and coordination. This whole discussion is around strategy. We're talking about it in other areas, but we need programs that are focused not on just the science and technology, but how do we develop those technologies in ways that don't compromise our security and our values. That is not trivial. We have to bake choices in from the front, and we need close coordination between experts in different areas: science, technology, security, society, all along the way. And then we need to really think about what does it mean to be, right, a citizen in a biological age. We need to enable anybody to be engaging with biotechnology, to get the best ideas and make sure that they're actually in the public interest. What does it mean to be literate in biotechnologies? We've had these conversations around codes and data. We need to be thinking about that in bio. So for those of you who are in the audience that may not be totally tracking all of these developments, Diane mentioned a few important developments, but I think it's worth mentioning a few more. So I think the US is arguably in a leadership position, and we've had conversations in the US 2 years ago. There was a White House summit on America's bioeconomy that emphasized the strategic importance of biotech. We've seen efforts to develop an Engineering Biology Research and Development Act that didn't quite make it through the finish line in the last administration, but are finding new life in Endless Frontiers and other efforts. But we need to make sure these are resourced at a sufficient level. We see reports, Diane mentioned one with Safeguarding the Bioeconomy effort. There's been other efforts as well to actually, like, the devil is in the details when it comes to, how do we couple promotion and protection? How do we strike that balance between competition and collaboration in different areas? What are the actual public policy mechanisms that we might use? And then we get strategic efforts like the MIIs from DoD that Tara mentioned. But depending on whether or not you're asking Jason or Tara, I guess, it depends on whether or not we need one big one or many all across the country. I think we need big things, many places connected all together. I also just wanted to mention that I think we're seeing these strategic investments, but we need to really think big and look to other areas. We have an AI.gov. We have an AI national strategy. Where is SB.gov? Where is bio.gov? I think we need to be looking at whether or not those models also manifest here. And I think there's encouraging signs in the Biden administration's national security interim guidance in really asking these questions and asking how we center our values and demonstrate that those values actually are an advantage in the way we deploy technologies. And I think it's great that we have Eric Lander in a cabinet level position, right? Somebody who knows about biotechnology, can think about these issues. So I think there's a lot that we have to seize this moment. So just to end off, I think there's basically a number of particular issues. We can dive into them, but I think we need to support national scale efforts that define the standards to promulgate standards around the globe. We need to co-situate policy scholarship with technology development. We need coordination at a national level across many agencies. We need funding for a basic and applied research to underpin all of this. And we clearly need to be training the next generation, not to just be workers, right? Not just to be a workforce, but to be the type of informed citizens that we want in our societies. And just thank you very much for convening this discussion at a really important moment.
Oh, absolutely. Well, thank you all so much. I'd say if I had to sum up in one word, the constant theme of what I heard in all your remarks is opportunity, right? There's tremendous potential for biotech, but of course that has an important caveat, right? We have to make the proper investments in things like R&D and human capital. We have to make sure that the norms and principles for how biotechnologies are used are in place. Here at CNAS, we've done a lot of thinking and writing about thinking strategically about technology. So Megan, you mentioned, I think at the outset, right? Like, what is the biotech future that we desire? We've been asking similar questions when it comes to technology. Where does the United States want to be 20, 30, 40 years from now? Ultimately, that's the fundamental question we have to ask if we want to be able to craft a coherent strategy on how to do this, particularly how does America thrive in this era of technology competition. To kick things off, I just want to ask all of you just this question. Is there anything unique about biotechnologies or synthetic biology in particular when it comes to this concept of tech competition?
I have thoughts. Tara, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, yes. The only other time in history that I can think of when the United States was not a leader in a technology that was essential not just to its security, but to its national power, to its economy and the health of its people, was when we did not have missile defense at the end of World War II. And our solution to that was to grab up all the Nazi scientists who knew all about it and bring them to America. And we created our own indigenous, expertise in all things related to rockets and missiles, for good or for bad. We're at a moment where we really were the innovation engine of the biorevolution. because tech comes from science, right? The best definition of technology I've heard is the harnessing of the understanding of a natural phenomena, or maybe more than one natural phenomena, to human purpose. And science and technology are iterative. You can learn more science if you've got the right tools to interrogate nature, and you can create more technology if you really understand how the natural world works. So it's iterative, making, unlike what Vannevar Bush proposed, it's not a pipeline. You don't automatically get technology out of doing basic science, which we have to keep in mind. But we have done all this terrific basic science. We've got a great ecosystem for converting science into technology, albeit dependent upon market forces, which don't cover everything we need for the nation. But China actually knows a lot about the science because it's reading these open source articles, which we have printed appropriately, I think, as a consequence of huge US investment in basic research. So the question is, are we going to make good on this phenomenal investment that we have made, mostly in aid of human health? And are we going to broaden our horizons as a country to include these two other aspects of biotechnology, namely synthetic biology for production of materials that we need and synthetic biology for planetary health? And are we going to do it in time and at the scale that's needed? So I think biotechnology is the most important of the critical technologies. And I say that because I think it needs the most attention from policymakers and is the least understood. Nobody can describe AI, but everybody knows we need it. The same is not true for biotech. People think they know what biotech is. They think it's mRNA. They probably wouldn't think of Impossible Burgers, let alone cultured meat. But we need to help policymakers understand what biotech is and understand the full scope of applications that is at stake, because we are in a race with China.
Great, thank you, Tara. Jason, do you want to weigh in on that question as well?
Yeah, I think Tara's answer is perfect. I'd add one small bit about what I consider to be unique about biology, just as a technology, period. Which is that unlike other forms of engineering, which humans invented and then built up over time to come up with these various applications for the technology, we did not invent biology. We inherited biology, right? So it is the product of 4 billion years of evolution on the planet. And as a consequence, it handles some pretty dramatic things for us, like, producing our atmosphere, right? All our food, cleaning water, right? So it is a much more fundamental thing compared to other human engineered technologies that we sort of bolted on to the biological world that we all take for granted. And we're entering an era of being able to design biology to put human intent more directly into that substrate. It moves faster. It's going to move faster than these other areas because it's already there. So like when you come up with something that improves it, like you don't have to then build all the edifice, because biology is already at scale on planet Earth, right? And so there's just something to it, and you can feel it with how COVID-19 impacted us, so quickly globally, right? Like that is. Like that's a biology hallmark, right? And so like you should expect something similar, as we improve the, our rate of being able to design this technology. Like it will make big impacts quickly by nature of the substrate. And I think we don't have as good intuition about that because it's the first substrate we didn't invent that we engineer.
Excellent. We have several audience questions coming in. So let me turn to the first one here. And this is a question from Gopal Ratnam, who's a tech reporter at Congressional Quarterly. So Gopal would like to talk a little bit about funding for these efforts. So Congress is now considering the Endless Frontier Bill that foresees spending $100 billion on 10 different tech areas, including biotechnology and synthetic biology. So considering the kind of sweeping bioeconomy infrastructure that Tara and others want to build, is the $100 billion enough? If not, what do you think should be the goal? And also, what do you think about the proposal in the legislation to create a technology directorate at the NSF to translate basic science into applications? So I'll open that up to all of you, whoever would like to take a whack at responding. It's a big question.
I can offer a few comments here. You know, this piece of legislation, like others, is rapidly evolving in this moment, and so we need to look back at the scale. In early iterations, it's notable that, you know, biotechnology is only one of the 10 technology areas that's articulated in that initial list of priority areas, but we can already see the ways that biotechnology is interacting with other areas. I think I might get the details incorrect, but like, you know, the semiconductor industry had a biotechnology strategy, right, to figure out how these types of technologies are interacting with other critical technology areas. And so I think, again, the devil is in the details when we look at the ways that we present this foundational, you know, and platform technologies and the way it interacts. I think it's always a balance here. I think that investments in science technology are smart investments, that it always matters how they're made. And so, you know, while we are investing in applied science and technology development, we need to make sure that we're not forgetting about foundational science and technology development. And we especially need to make sure that we're not decoupling this from the type of social behavioral research and applications in building up our other types of infrastructure that can and institutions that can leverage those investments. So it's not a simple question, but I think here we need to be bold in this moment, I think, in making our investments, and it's not only going to come from one place. This is one of a suite of things that we need to be able to pursue.
Yeah, this is Diane. I will chime in here, and as the I guess I'm the only panelist here who's a member of the federal government, so I won't say the federal government should or should not. I won't advocate for federal investment one way or the other, but I'll add on to what Megan was saying in that I think it's not just the federal investment. I think that's going to be important, and in particular, the coordination, the organization, the strategy, sort of a country level strategy. I think those are important things government can do. But a lot of what's happening on the ground, the kinds of things that Jason described, the innovations, and Tara described some of these innovations too, they're coming from industry. Industry is really leading this space right now, more so than the federal government is leading the innovations in this space. And so how can government benefit that? How can they make that work even better? How can they get more companies to take risks on innovations, or are there things that the government can be doing to make regulatory pathways smoother for innovative products to get on the market, and understanding how those kinds of things can happen? And so one thing I'll mention, and we talked about this in the when we were having meetings for the Academy's study on the bioeconomy. One other example, because I noted in the question you also asked about NSF investment as well. There was a program for nanotechnology that was funded by the federal government. It was a nanotechnology initiative that went that was actually legislated and went for many years, and it's still going. It's very cool. It's dynamic. It's got a website, and you can look at all the things on there for the nanotechnology initiative. And some have suggested, should there be like a similar thing for synthetic biology? I think one of the most important things that the nanotechnology initiative did was bring industry together with all the different components like academia and the workforce, and getting people educated in STEM and nanotech, and bringing the regulators together with the innovators, doing standards, right? What are the standards for the bioeconomy going to be? What are good standards to use for synthetic biology products? And we haven't invented those yet, but if we envision this broad bioeconomy coming forward, we're gonna have standards that we use and that we use internationally. So anyway, those are just, I think, those are the kinds of things that the government might be better at doing than inventing. Because it seems like the private sector is doing a good job with the inventing part, at least right now. So back to you.
Great, thank you, Diane. For the non-government employees here, any specific thoughts on the NSF Tech directorate? Because I know there's been some concern, particularly in the scientific community, that would perhaps shift the original purpose of the NSF in a way that would not be healthy for the long term.
Well, I think this goes back to the canard that science and technology are separate rather than iterative. I want to foot stomp what Diane said about the Endless Frontier Bill being more like a punctuation mark and the recognition of our national leaders that the country needs to do a lot more in science and tech. That is going to be one of the defining qualities of America and the world, hopefully in the decades to come. So I don't think it's so much about the number in the bill, which is still twirling around and changing. I think it's about the seriousness of purpose that the bill hopefully exemplifies. I do think that the gap between the public and the private sector, particularly in biotech, is a serious problem. We crossed that gap in crisis under COVID. It wasn't easy and it wasn't pretty. And we need to figure out how to get back to the days after World War II when there was a lot more meshing of the government and the private sector. And hopefully this bill will help us do that. So I'm in favor of a tech directorate in NSF. I want all of the science and tech budgets to go up. I view 100 billion as a start, not the end game.
Great. Well, let's.
Go
ahead, Jason.
My only small quick add. Ginkgo is a sort of a like hard technology company. In other words, like the founding of the company was based on technology that had like embedded technical risk. And if you look at like our venture ecosystem in the United States, it's very good at supporting companies that have market risk, right? Like, are people going to want to order taxis on their phone, or are people going to want to ride scooters around? Right? Like these are market questions. That they're not technical questions. Of course, you can build a scooter network, right? Hard technology companies, actually, the private sector still has a very hard time funding these, with the exception of a small number of areas. Particular therapeutics is like one of the few working areas of still technical risk that gets private sector investment at the early stage. It's not basic science. It's not growth investing like the stage that Ginkgo's at today, where we have a working technology. It's that in-between period. And frankly, without the government more directly participating in that, I do think we see companies like SpaceX and Tesla on a lark, right? Like it only happened because like Musk had enough money to throw at it. Our actual venture ecosystem, like in Silicon Valley and other places, does not know how to support those companies. And and it's because they're technically risky. And I honestly think the NSF with a technology remit could close a gap there in a very interesting way, in my opinion.
Excellent.
I think it's also worth noting that we built a huge infrastructure to buy down that technical risk in the physical sciences. We've got 17 DOE national labs. We've got 7 different budget levels for translating technology in DOD, et cetera, et cetera. We have not done that with the life sciences. We need to.
Okay, well, let's switch gears a bit and let's talk about multilateralism. So I would argue that an effective strategy for American competitiveness would include partnering with like-minded countries. And Scott Malcolmson has a question along these lines. Scott asks, how do you see biotech working with efforts at building new international alliances or revising and reworking old ones in order to set standards and encourage research? Would anyone like to take a stab at that one?
Well, I think we're all going to say yes, right? We need to do that. We are doing that to some extent. Certainly the biomedical innovation ecosystem is intensely international. And as Megan said earlier, we do not want to crush global collaboration, particularly in basic research, out of fear of competition with China or anybody else. I think one way to foster multilateral efforts is to get behind big projects, as I said, and make them international efforts. And certainly forging standards is going to require a multinational effort. But it would be, I think, the wise way to go if we were to collaborate first with our close friends abroad, and then take on big projects that would benefit some of the less fortunate countries. Getting vaccines to the developing world would be one way to start. But I don't think there's going to be any choice. I think this is going to have to be a multinational effort. The question is, who calls the meeting and what's the meeting about? That should be the United States, I think.
I think it's worth pointing to a few different efforts going on now. There's starting off with the synthetic biology field and like the iGEM competition. I think the iGEM competition involves something like 4 dozen different countries, right, that are sending their young trainees to meet the rest of the world in solving many of these global challenges that Tara mentioned. And it is motivating, and it will require many different people solving both problems at the local scale, but also motivated by these global challenges with a technology that doesn't respect our human-made borders. And so that's going to be necessary. We have a few new efforts. I'm co-chairing right now a new World Economic Forum Global Future Council on synthetic biology that actually Jason sits on as well. And part of our starting point is to look at those far futures and ask, at a planetary scale, what's at stake in being able to develop or not biotechnology in ways that reflect the values that we care about. And by really starting out at that far future and then backcasting to the decisions we make today, we won't get caught up in some of the near-term things that can often distract from the bigger picture here. So again, yes, and I think it is important on who convenes the meeting, as Tara says.
Yeah, I would agree that U.S. leadership will be critical, right? We still have the best convening power of any other country on the planet for these things, and I'm very encouraged by how the Biden administration is approaching these issues. Right, we're seeing a lot of bilateral engagement, multilateral engagement with the Quad, for example. In just a few days, we'll have a big summit with the European Union, where the Trade and Technology Council will be an agenda item as well. So a lot of very good indicators that we're moving down a path to effective multilateral engagement on a whole range of tech policy issues. Let me turn to a question from Rebecca Hu. Rebecca says, so in addition to pushing incentives, what are some demand pull incentives? She gives examples of government procurements, advanced market commitments that you would recommend the government deploy given recent developments in technologies. What are the application markets of synthetic biology that are the most ripe for these types of federal contracts?
So I can comment a little bit there. So I think it's like a really key concept. Like, and it is a playbook the U.S. has used before with critical technologies. So if you look at the semiconductor industry, for example, in the 50s, it was half U.S. government demand, right? And it was, basically lightweight electronics for, aeronautics, Minuteman, things like that, right? And so there was a big demand pull that helped ensure that, you didn't know if it was going to be Fairchild or Intel or TI that was going to ultimately be like the global semiconductor winner, but chances were it was going to be a US company because we had both the biggest supply technology base and we were creating the most demand for the technology. And sure enough, we got Intel, which gave us a 50-year position of leverage in that critical technology area. And so 100%, I think demand pull is essential. I think it does dovetail very well, as mentioned earlier, with this idea of, how do we build back after the pandemic, as we are looking at supply chains here in the US? And the answer is biology is programmable like a computer. In other words, you put in different code and it does different things. Like that is the magic of computers, right? Like just a different piece of software and that machine goes after a new market. But at the end of the day, computers just move information around, right? And so if you look at what was disrupted by computers, it was all the information-based industries, media, telecom, finance, right? Advertising. Cells are programmable, but they don't move information, they move atoms. And so if you look at what's going to be disrupted, it is all the physical goods-based industries, right? The Impossible Burger is the first real innovation in burgers, in 100 years probably, right? And so that's coming, right? And so if you want to think about where to pull, it's advanced materials, right? It's advanced, chemicals, fuels, agents, things like that, right? It is anything that is high complexity physical goods, I think, is a place to put a bet on biology over the next 10 to 20 years. And so that's my, in addition to all the places it already exists, right? Food and water and things like that, right? But if you're looking at new areas, I would say, high complexity materials, and then obviously in the area of medicines. But there's a lot there already. So I would say if the U.S. government was going to specifically put their foot on the scale, I would do it outside of medicine.
Great, thank you, Jason.
Yeah, this is Diane. I'll just chime in on that a little bit from the Department of Defense perspective as well. I think I would second everything that Jason said and say that for DoD, some of the low-hanging fruit is absolutely in that space, right? Of materials, which I talked about at the beginning, because they're sort of the soonest to mature, most ready for prime time kinds of things that we can be doing. And I would say, I think also some of the benefit in that space, and we've seen this in the past, is that if DoD needs a flame retardant material for missiles, for ship hulls, for aircraft, that material is also going to find its way into civilian applications on, fire trucks and flame retardant material for buildings and clothing, or, whatever it may be. So I think those spillover technologies that, have a defense purpose, that we can build that up and find a need for it in the armed forces, and then it readily translates to a civilian application. That's a win-win, right? That's a win for government investment, that has a win for companies who can then market those things into civilian society. So I would add to what Jason said by saying, try to pick those things that can work in both spaces.
I would add to both of those excellent comments that the government must create the talent pipeline. And it has to start very early. We need to rethink science education, as we did with the National Defense Act after Sputnik, and get more people into science and tech so they have the basic vocabulary and knowledge to create a Ginkgo Bioworks or a flame retardant material. But we also need to get more technically fluent people into government, and at all levels, including the senior levels. That skill set has been much depleted over past years, and it's been a long, long time since we actively recruited people into government in the, ask not what your country can do for you fashion. And we need to do that again. We need a flood of people with S&T backgrounds, or at least S&T literacy in government, to pull this off. And we have to figure out how we're going to get that accomplished.
And I just thought I would add one comment. I think it's useful here to recognize, like Tara was saying, talent that's required at all levels. Jason highlighting these like foundational investments in bio capabilities, right? In reading, writing, editing, evolving, measuring, right? At that scale that will benefit across all application areas, but also that there's very specific needs in specific application areas that may differ, which reinforces this challenge, right? It's interesting to see in therapeutics and development of the CAR T cells. Well, there's particular innovations that allow us to think through the regulatory regimes in those areas. There's other audacious challenges that we have been spending many years working on since the advent of modern molecular biology, like nitrogen fixation, right? That will need a different type of investment than other types of more mature technologies. So I think this is why we need a national biotechnology strategy, because it ramifies in so many different ways, and it will require different types of investments and different types of strategies in different places.
Excellent. Thank you, Megan. Jason, let me turn to you. I've heard you say numerous times in other settings that you have a vision for Ginkgo Bioworks, doing for biotech companies what Amazon AWS did for software companies with your synthetic bio platform. Could you tell us a little bit about what exactly that means, what that vision is? And I'd love to hear then what you see the implications being, for example, for manufacturing.
Yeah, happy to comment on it. I reserve the right to ask Tara a question at the end of it, though. The core idea is, if you look at the history of Ginkgo, like when we started the company, we started out of grad school. We didn't have funding initially. We had to like scrounge lab equipment. It was like launching a biotech company today, even if you did one tomorrow, is a lot of work, right? You have to build a whole lab and buy all this equipment and da 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 da. So it makes it very hard. Unlike, say, if you were a new software developer and you wanted to launch a website or app, you could deploy that at huge scale by interfacing with all of these other companies that have built out the infrastructure like AWS to let you serve that up worldwide tomorrow, right? And the idea behind Ginkgo is if you wanted to launch a new app, a new cell program, don't build your own lab, just use our infrastructure to do the work, to do the lab work for you and to do the cell programming for you. And we make all that available to our partners. We have a lot of, I keep pointing behind me, we have about 200,000 square feet of like robotics that we use to drive the cost down of doing this work. And then we also have big data assets. And this is the question I want to ask Tara, but we accumulate genetic code as we do the work at Ginkgo that we also make available to our customers, so that almost like software libraries, right? Like it's pre-existing code that's been debugged previously by other people that you can use for your cell programming project so that you can program a cell to do something new. And so that's why we say it's like AWS. We want to have ultimately thousands of companies running on top of our platform doing their biotech work. And we just want to be horizontal infrastructure that helps them out. Okay. But it highlights this data part of it. There is a key asset, which is like the genetic code, right? That goes into writing cell programs I highlighted earlier was not invented by humans. In other words, like we inherit that from all of the biology on planet Earth. And there was a question that Tom asked here in the chat that Tara answered about, hey, should we be sequencing all of the, flora and fauna Tara suggested in North America, right? So you're talking about these like big hairy projects, like could you elaborate on it? Like, why bother, as you think about it, Tara?
Well, you're right. I mean, if you think of different combinations of genetic code as libraries, as book in a library, okay? Because a lot of genetics is comparative. The bigger your library, the bigger your vocabulary, the more things you can make. There's a reason why BGI in China is sequencing everything it can get its hands on, and making concerted efforts to sequence the genomes of humans outside their mostly Han population of China. Heterogeneity in your library is very, very valuable. The United States has a lot of sequencing data, but most of it is held in proprietary hands, like Ginkgo's, okay? I'm not saying that's bad. I'm all for the free market. I work at a venture capital company, albeit a nonprofit one. But the United States as a country ought to proactively start building its library. And it ought to be a really great library.
Yeah.
That's very easy to use. So what I've heard is that all of the people who are earnestly trying to sequence these variants of COVID-19 in the United States are filing their code in Europe because it's so labor intensive to put sequences into GenBank, the US library, if you will. And GenBank is about $200 million a year. It's a little annex of NIH. NIH will go crazy when I say that, but it's true, okay? It's not really a useful tool for graduate students and researchers and entrepreneurs. We ought to fix that.
Yeah.
And to do that, we ought to have some big gnarly project like, you know, okay, let's sequence all of the big animals in North America. I'd rather do all of the flora and fauna. That would be a good project. And let's have
the Human Genome Project, like the American Genome Project, just like sequence everything, all of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, all the stuff.
But we're so far behind in, for example, our precision medicine project, which has been in the works for 10 years. It's not fully funded and we're still enrolling. It would be fine if we had, you know, one go around and we decided to make it bigger and kept enrolling, but that's not what's going on, okay? So we need to get serious about sequencing as a national asset. That data is a national asset, and we need to build it up.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it's almost like oil wells or something, you know, right? And where, again, the U.S. is fortunate. We have like so many different biomes, right? That we actually have a pretty broad swath of plant, animal, microbial life that is, you know, is basically.
And some of them are still alive. Yeah. You know, unlike a lot of the animals in China. This goes back to trying to communicate to policymakers the breadth of biotechnology's potential application and what it takes to do it. I think literacy on this score is absolutely critical to moving forward. I still think that most policymakers hear biotechnology or they hear genomics and they think medicines. And that's about it.
Yeah.
I know. I'm wondering if some of the there's some small successes we could look at in agriculture. So, for example, you know, we have a soil microbe repository where soil microbes have been collected from all around and sequenced. And we're, you know, there's been this sort of long lumbering project called Neon that was attempting to collect all kinds of biological diversity and do that kind of sequencing. So I think, you know, we've had some of these efforts in the past that sort of had uneven support, uneven interest. But, you know, maybe now we can make the argument with this burgeoning bioeconomy that some of these efforts that you're talking about, Tara, you know, now's the time to get much more serious about this as infrastructure, and how do we support these and move them forward. You know, getting to the human piece too. Someone said something very interesting at a meeting I was at a couple of weeks ago, where we were talking about sharing genomic data and how there are sort of uneven international components to this. So in other words, the US, you know, we share everything, we put everything out there, but some countries like China or others may not share data with us. And someone in that meeting said, why are we worried about whether or not the Chinese share their human data with us? We have so many Chinese people here in the United States that are willing to share their genomic information. Why don't we just go to those people and say, here it is, and we could get a lot of that here. So that kind of put in my mind a different way of thinking about it that harkens back to what you're saying. We have rich diversity here. We have rich biological diversity, human diversity, ecological diversity, and maybe we should be getting much more seriously about banking all that data.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I just think this just reinforces some of the original points that we really need to be thinking beyond the human in being able to, collect and leverage all of this biological diversity that's really the biggest asset here, and the need for coordination, right? Like we just had, for example, like the vertebrates genome project, right? But that needs to be connected to all the other genome projects, and then we need to be, this is a coordination and connection problem. And we've seen this also in other areas, including in AI. There's, great discussions around, right? Is it just that it's not just the data, it's actually about, and it's not about securing the data, it's actually about also creating those close connections between the people who need to use the data. And we're not always so great at talking about where we need to create connections. It's often we talk about where we need to secure things. And so, as my colleague Mark Salit would say, we need to think about not just creating like barriers, but grooves, right? How do we create faster transactions to the people who need to both use and contribute to these growing repositories of knowledge that can enable everyone to pursue diverse ends.
We have a very interesting question here from Georgia Lagudis on regulatory policy. How does regulatory policy for new biotech need to adjust as more complex products are created and ones that impact more aspects of our life or world? Is there a new mindset we need to have to balance safety and innovation? It's a very deep question.
It is, and I'll say hi to Georgie, one of my students from my class. Thanks for joining the call today. So in terms of regulation, and there are people who like Jason who experience the real world of regulation in real time. So I'll let others respond. But I will say that we spent some time talking about this in the National Academy study, but there was also another study about how we regulate biotech projects writ large here in the United States. And, that was just sort of refreshed recently. And prior to that, it hadn't been refreshed since something like 1976. So if you look at like all of the innovations and advances that have been happening in biotechnology since we first started regulating biotechnology products, right? It's really been light years ahead that the science has moved. I think there's something to think about is the way you make something versus the something, right? So there are things you want, products and things we want to make, all these things that we're talking about, all these innovations that would be great to use, that would be, important to have for DoD or for the citizenry, whatever they might be. And there's a process for making them that can involve emerging and innovative biotechnology. And then there's the actual thing itself. So from my view, and this is just very, 10,000 foot view, looking at the safety and security of the thing itself, you want to think about, okay, is this a chemical that I made from petroleum, or is this the exact same chemical that I made from yeast? If I made it from yeast, then I might think that's safer, better, uses less energy, puts less toxic things out in the environment. It's still the exact same chemical at the end of the day, right? Or is this a thing that is a biologically engineered entity that I want to sell or put out into the environment? And then you might have a different way of thinking about it. So for me, those are kind of the two. What's the process we use to get there versus what is the thing itself that we need to think about its safety. And again, I don't know what others on the panel think about it. That's like a very fundamental answer to a very complex question.
Thank
I
you,
think
Diane.
in terms of this mindset challenge, we need to think of not like balancing safety and innovation always. I think we need innovation and in not just safety and regulatory science coupled to these innovations, but new ways of even just like measuring the impacts of technologies we already have to figure out what the comparative advantage is. I'm reminded of early days in the synthetic biology research, engineering research center. We actually worked on some projects where we had early stage projects in this case in biofuels early on, but we worked with regulators and environmentalists and others to actually develop new research agendas and new lines of research around measurement technologies and also in ways to engineer in safety from the very beginning. And so I think that mindset is really important to ask these questions at the early stages and consider it sort of part of your technology development strategy, not something that happens at the end.
We have a question from Molly Gosling at the British Embassy in Washington. Molly would be interested to hear your thoughts on the public communication angle. So we know that genetically modified food crops had a bit of a PR disaster, and that public uptake and acceptance hindered the S&T cycle. How do we make sure that this doesn't happen with synthetic biology? It has changed somewhat, as we have seen with the Impossible Burger. Why do we think that is?
Well, I'll take that. I think this is going to be an ongoing challenge. I think people are rightly anxious about messing around with Mother Nature. Or most people are anxious about that. And I think we have to, as Megan suggested, build in cautiousness to not just science experiments, but to technology at whatever scale. That said, I'll come around to my first remarks. I think we have to explain that the solution to some of our big problems is going to have to engage Mother Nature. And we have to figure out how to use this 4 billion evolutionary experiment responsibly, but also creatively. It is, in my view, biotechnology is the only way we feed the world. It is the only way we maintain the health and happiness of the population without destroying the ecosystems upon which we depend. We've got to get off of petroleum-based products. We will have no choice. Future generations depend upon it. And telling that story in its accurate fullness, the risks as well as the benefits, I think is the way to craft, I hate calling it a regulatory regime, but crafting a way forward for each of us involved in the projects to be responsible.
Yep. And maybe I'd add one small thing to that. We thought a lot about this at Ginkgo. So maybe about 5 years ago, US was considering GMO labeling nationally. This ultimately passed. And at the time, under good advice from our creative director here at Ginkgo, Christina Agapakis, we put an editorial in the New York Times that said, I run a GMO company, I think we should label GMOs. And this was a controversial take at the time from the industry side. And the theory of it was like scientists and engineers are enamored with the idea that like, it's just an education problem, right? Like if we had more STEM or something, people would understand GMOs better. And, like fundamentally, that's not the issue. There's been 1 trillion meals eaten, right, in the US. There's not like another safety study needed. The fundamental problem is trust, right? Like, do you trust the organizations deploying powerful technology to act in your interests? And that's a very rational concern from people. And the number one way you eliminate trust is by being non-transparent, right? Like, oh, I want to know if this is in my food. No. I'm not going to tell you, right? And so this is, they brought up the Impossible Burger there. This is a big thing that Impossible got right, which was you go to their website and they explain exactly how that component's made. They show you the fermenters. They explain the genetic engineering, right? Like we should be proud of this technology. And in fact, the people that are going to be the biggest uptakers of biotech in the future, from my standpoint, are the people that care how their products are made, right? Like what Tara's talking about. It is a cleaner way to make things. It's a renewable way to make things. Biology is the original recycling system, you know, right? Like moving more of our extraction-based manufacturing infrastructure that we invented in the Industrial Revolution in the 1700s to a much more powerful technology of biology that's played well with the planet for 4 billion years, not 300. It's going to be a good thing. And so we actually think those people are ultimately proponents in the future of biotechnology as we build that trust. But you know, you have to do it right. You have to be transparent, and you have to give people things like the Impossible Burger that give them a benefit, right? You know, a veggie burger that doesn't taste like cardboard moves people's opinions on GMOs more than anything. Yeah.
I think it's important to reinforce, there've been some great research on this that has demonstrated some of the things that Jason mentions, right? That motivations matter, and that people are making, in many cases, informed choices about what applications they want and don't want. It's not just blanket, they don't want a certain type of GMOs. It matters if it's a health application. It matters if it's a cosmetic application. And I think if we're really serious about baking in our values into this technology development, we have to bake in values of public participation and enabling people to make those choices along the way. And so it's great to see these types of developments that are differentiating the way we need to operate today to earn that trust.
I think we have time for just about one more question. And I like this one in the sense that, you know, kind of ties together everything we've been talking about in terms of American competitiveness, and ultimately how it looks like China will be one of the main competitors in this space. And this is a question from Michael Finn. And it's a very specific question. He would like to know what biopharma products or sectors, if any, will Chinese companies compete directly with innovative US companies in 5 to 10 years, or perhaps even sooner. Perhaps that time frame is even shorter than that.
They're competing now. They're competing now. China just got its first FDA approval of an innovative, brand new mechanism cancer drug last year. All of the major pharma companies, the multinational companies, are at work in China. They're building big complexes. AstraZeneca just built a $1 billion complex to apply AI to pharma in China. China needs medicines. It has tremendous health problems, and particularly in cancer. It is already a competitor. It's the #2 pharma market in the world. It will soon be #1. So that game is on.
Mark, I'd have maybe one small thing. You know, there's also a question here from Ari from the Defense Science Board. We talk about the ethics of human enhancement and how far away is that from being a reality. I would highlight in the context of COVID-19, the thing I'm much more concerned about, I actually think human enhancement is very far away, and human engineering gets this like overwhelming share of attention. Whereas like if you talk to any parent, messing with their kids is not high on their priority list in unpredictable ways. So I actually think the much bigger concern post COVID-19 is infectious disease, and where we really need to lead in the U.S. is preventing the weaponization of this technology. You know, reaffirming the Biological Weapons Convention, which is long-standing, been effective worldwide, and also leading in biodefense. In other words, making it so that bioweapons are obsolete before they ever get built is very strongly in the interest of the United States. You know, right? Like we don't need a new category of WMDs out there. You know, if we invest in biosecurity over the next 18 months in response to COVID worldwide, which we should do anyway, we will at the same time effectively build missile defense. And we don't have it right now, as is apparent from the last 2 years, and we should build it.
That's a great point, Jason. Diane, Megan, you both have written a lot about biotech threats and dual use research governance. Do you have any thoughts on those specific points in the context of Ari's question?
Yeah, I agree with everything Tara said. You know, the Chinese, they're already there. They're already competing with us. They have a huge population. They have an elderly and continuing to age population that they need medicines for, not just cancer, but everything that a growing elderly population requires. They have to feed everyone. And if you are in particular a type of regime that the CCP is, having a starving population is not going to be a good thing if you're trying to stay in power. So for them, continuing to feed and provide medicines for their population is hand in hand with maintaining their regime. As much as it is, we think of it as a humanitarian thing, but it is as much of importance to them in maintaining their state structure. So yes, they're competing in everything, materials, medicines, all those things. In regards to what Jason said about infectious disease, I would actually broaden that to include environmental, livestock, animals, crops. Certainly, we hope nothing bad happens that would, obliterate wheat or corn or any of those things that we very much depend on here in the United States, or other places around the world. So I would include not just human disease, but plant and animal disease as well in that category.
Yeah, and just to build off that, when it comes to biological, threats, I think this whole discussion is emphasized, right? This is a technology that has profound global benefits, right? Because it's already a global technology, and it also has profound global risks as we're confronting, a infectious disease that quickly spread around the globe, but it is not the worst thing that we can imagine. And one of the central challenges is how we constantly, stretch our imagination in thinking about, what's the next thing. We can't just protect against the one thing we've seen before, but also that, paying attention to the things we already know are threats that require, a multi-scale strategy. There was, and so, myself and others have contended that we really need a ongoing, experimental approach to these issues, where we're learning, how to manage the risks and the benefits as quickly as we're learning to engineer life and engineering living systems. And that's going to require all different types of disciplines and professions and communities to be working together. And it's the type of a big challenge that Tara mentioned, right? This is a compelling, important challenge of our time. And so I'm glad that all of these topics are coming together in one conversation, and we have the opportunity to seize the moment.
Could I add one thing on biothreats, Martin?
Absolutely, Tara, go ahead.
I agree with everybody's comments. One thing that I think would help us enforce the BWC would be to get much more sophisticated in our capacity to assign attributions to biothreats. We're seeing the lack of that capacity play out now in the argument about where did COVID-19 come from, which is transforming a scientific question into a geopolitical one. Were there ever to be a bioattack on anything, plant, animal, or human, that would become an even more urgent issue to solve. The country has not really thought about what we would do with a sample of something we snatched from somewhere we were worried about, or a clinical sample that we thought might be indicative of a bioweapon. We need to think through the science and the policy and practice of assigning attribution in a much more sophisticated way than we have thus far. Right now, we don't even know which agency is responsible. It would probably default to whoever had the sample, maybe not a good thing. We don't have, a SWAT team of people who know how to do these things. When I was undersecretary, we actually destroyed one sample that turned out to be real anthrax because the people handling it didn't know what they were doing. It was not NBAC, it was not a scientific group, let me hasten to add. But we need to think about this much more carefully, and we should do it internationally. There should be a consensus approach to how we assign attribution for big, bad infectious disease events.
Great, thank you, Tara. Well, we're already a few minutes past the hour, so unfortunately we're gonna have to end this discussion today. This was absolutely fantastic. I can't thank our speakers enough. Diane DiEuliis, Megan Palmer, Tara O'Toole, and Jason Kelly, thank you so much for being here today. Really want to thank our audience as well. Fantastic questions. And I apologize we didn't get to them all, but we'll be doing more events like this in the future. Looking forward to having you join us for those. And I also want to give a quick thank you to my colleagues, Megan Lamberth, Ainiki Rikkonen, and Henry Wu for helping to make this event such a success. Looking forward to seeing you again very soon. In the meantime, be well, and we look forward to seeing you at the next CNAS event. Take care, everyone.